And
Great.
hi, I'm Susan Saylor, and I'm interviewing Dinnie Goldring. Dinnie, thanks for being willing to talk about some of your pathwork experiences. How did you happen to get connected with pathwork?
Yeah, so I got connected with pathwork the way that a lot of people in our region did, which is that Sue Van Duren, who was the only helper in our region, started to give lectures. And she had been my therapist for many years. And she sent out this beautiful little card inviting us to the lecture. And I thought, this looks weird. But I thought, Sue's offering it, and I have so much respect for her. And so I went to the first lecture, and I will tell you, Susan, from that very lecture, I was just caught. I was hooked by what I had experienced that night. Yeah.
What was so powerful in that lecture that you were hooked on the basis of one lecture?
Yeah. So the lecture was the higher self, the lower self, and the mask. And there were two really big things that caught me. One is that I learned so much new about myself. And at that time, I'd been in therapy for a long time, on and off throughout my life. And I was a therapist myself. And yet here was this teaching that allowed me to see different parts of myself that I had never seen. And especially the lower self. I think that I started to recognize the parts of me that want to manipulate or do manipulate or tell half truths in order to try and get what I want. And before, I had felt so ashamed of those parts, I didn't even acknowledge them. But acknowledging them was so freeing for me. It was like, oh, I could start to trust myself because I could see those parts of myself and know that I could work with them. And that was such a relief. It was such a relief. Yeah.
That certainly makes sense to me. And what a vast comfort. So the psychology of pathwork drew you in.
Yes, absolutely.
And pathwork is also a spiritual practice. So how did that sit with you?
Yeah, I was raised Jewish in a what's called like conservative Judaism, not politically conservative, but and there wasn't a lot about like a real connection with the divine. And so I think if it had started out with that for me, it would have been maybe too much. But the psychology really drew me in. And I struggled then with the spiritual part. Now it's such a buoy to my life to have a connection with the divine and the divine within me, and knowing that the divine within me is one with all divine. But that part was a hard one for me to take in. I always say I want an evidence-based approach, and I started to feel spirit and feel the divine in my life. And that was my path toward the spiritual experience with pathwork. But it was definitely not what at first that part was like, oh, a little cringy for me.
Oh, I resonate with that. So you've talked about kind of a profound shift in how you understood yourself. How did that manifest in how you actually live your life?
Well, Susan, that's such a good question, because what started to happen is that, there were all these ways that I lived my life to protect myself and to make it so that, with my mask, as we say, so that others wouldn't see those darker parts of myself. And I pretended to be, I'm a reason type. So our mask is the serenity mask. And we are very prideful. And So I was just hooked on defending myself so others wouldn't see my darker sides. And when I started to take responsibility for that, I was more comfortable with myself. I could trust myself. I felt like I was more in integrity. And so that made it so I could assert myself in different ways. I could be more loving because I wasn't always worried about protection. I could connect with people in different ways. So those were big shifts for me.
Those are really profound changes. It sounds in many ways like pathwork was a really natural fit for you, but were there some hard parts for you?
Yeah. So as I said before, the spiritual part was hard for me to accept, to believe, to trust that there is help for me. You know, I was one of my profound strengths, but defenses is to be able to do everything myself. And of course I can't. And to be able to allow myself to want help from the divine, and to accept that it's there for me was, I feel teary just thinking about it. That was such a hard transition for me. It really threw me for a loop. As I started to develop that, I struggled with it a lot.
Would you say it took like a half year? Over what period of time did you come to trust that?
I wish I could say it was a half a year, Susan. You know, at the beginning, I just went to the first Wednesday, or that time, first Friday lectures. And that was really for me a lot about the psychology of it. And then I decided to do the transformation program, TP. That was several years into my pathwork experience. And to be honest with you, Susan, you know, it was incremental, and it's still incremental, but my real struggle with that was in the fifth block of TP. So that was 2.5 years into TP that I really had to grapple with that and start to soften to that and start to develop that trust. But it wasn't without like a real inner reckoning, a dark reckoning for me, I'll say, Susan, but coming out on the other side, feeling very differently about spirit and about life and about myself.
That is really beautiful.
For me, certainly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, you've mentioned that the conservative Jewish religion did not do a lot spiritually for you, but did you try other paths, Buddhism or?
Yeah. Well, I was in therapy for a long time, and that's certainly a path of growth, but not as much a spiritual path. And I do have a guru, and I've had a relationship with my guru for 30 years. I never met him in his body, but I would say that was not like, it's very, very, very different than path work. It's not, my guru wasn't a guru who said, you have to do this and this and this. It's Neem Karoli Baba. And so I would say that part of my spiritual path is really just something that supports my work in path work and supports me throughout my life.
I think it's helpful for people to know that one can draw on a number of spiritual patterns.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've been meditating for about 3 decades. And I definitely incorporate Buddhist philosophy all the time into my daily life. It's been a huge part of my growth. And so that as well. But it really wasn't until pathwork that I really found like, oh, this is what I need. Yeah.
You probably know more about this than I do since you live in Pittsburgh, but I understand there are a number of self-help programs in Pittsburgh. I can't even name them, but how would you say Pathwork differs from them?
I will tell you that although I live in Pittsburgh, I've never been a part of any of the other groups here in Pittsburgh, so I don't think I would be a good person to be able to address that. Yeah.
Well, and as I say, I can't even name those others. I've just heard people refer to going to such and such a meeting.
Yeah.
Is there something we haven't talked about that you would really like to express?
I guess that the thing that I would like to say to anybody who's listening is that what the pathwork really brought to me was through seeing those darker parts of myself. And in pathwork, those parts of us aren't shamed. We just work with them. We know that they're a part of each person. They're not who we truly are. There are divine energies that have been twisted so that we think it's a solution to protect ourselves when we're young, or a way that we'll get love or appreciation. But so they're not something that we try to ignore. We actually turn toward them, which is true of other paths as well. But that acceptance and wanting to know those parts of ourselves, to make them conscious so that we can work with them, has been so profound. It has really brought me into integrity in a way that I don't think I ever knew I could be. And that allows me to have healthy assertion with people before I sort of wouldn't assert, because I knew there were these other parts, like somewhere, that weren't in integrity. So I didn't feel like I had the right to assert myself, or to really be, I feel like I can be more loving than I ever knew I could be, and to receive love. And those pieces are profound. And I want people to know about that possibility. I know I mentioned it in little pieces before, but that's the most important piece for me.
Oh, I agree with you. And Dinnie, thanks so much for being willing to talk about pathwork. I really appreciate that.
It's such a pleasure, and it's a pleasure to spend this time with you, Susan.